Okay. Thank you, and thank you for having me speak today. My name is Hillary Freeman of Freeman Law Offices. I have offices in both Princeton and Freehold, New Jersey. And like Melanie said, I specialize in advocating for people with disabilities across their lifespan. That includes special education, special education matters, which obviously includes bullying and accommodations in school and college, as well as guardianships, estate planning, so wills and special needs trusts, and adult services with DDD and DVRS. So today I'm going to talk about when bullying is a problem, what the school district's obligations are, and what your rights are as parents of children with disabilities. As you may be aware, bullying has become a major issue in schools, not over the past 10 years, but lately it seems to be getting much, much worse. Parents are students are being affected by other students, and also teachers and faculty members are impacting or bullying kids. I have a lot of cases lately where that's occurring. So this is a major problem in schools and in outside of the school environment. So I'm going to talk about what the district's obligations are and what your rights are inside of school and outside of school. Okay, so there are, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the overview. What is bullying, your legal rights and obligations, and what to do about it after you've identified it. Okay, so it's not just about lawsuits, which is ironic that I'm the one that's saying that, but it's not just about lawsuits. It's, you obviously want to minimize the impact of the bullying in schools and really obviously teach your child strategies that include appropriate social skills, behavior modifications, etc., maybe self-advocacy skills, which I'll get into a bit later. So that's the overview of the presentation, and to start out with, I'm going to talk about the bullying legislation that was, it became effective in September of 2011. Then there were some issues with whether there was a proper funding for it. The commission that was appointed it was deemed to officially to have enough funding for it, or there were some problems with it, but now it's definitely in effect. There are no questions about it. It definitely applies to schools. So what happened was that the New Jersey Commission of Bullying was created by a panel of both experts and parents to investigate the problems and to write legislation to really to address this problem in schools. It was, like I said, it was passed in January of 2011. It was really considered to be the toughest anti-bullying law in the nation. And I found a chart when I was doing research a while ago about this, where the federal government made recommendations on what to include in the anti-bullying legislation, and there was a really long list of factors that, of recommendations that each state should include. They're not requirements; they were just recommendations. And actually, New Jersey was really the only state that included every single recommendation from the federal government. So it is really, at this point, I would say agree that it is considered to be the toughest law in the nation. It aimed to address a lot of flaws, and they wanted to the commission, who was, like I said, made up of legal experts and prevention experts, really did take every measure to address how to identify it, how to make it known to everybody, and what the ramifications are. So the legislation is it's called HIB, okay? Bullying, harassment, intimidation, bullying. You're going to hear me talk about that throughout this presentation. It's considered harassment. It's HIB laws. Keep in mind that this is different than the legal definition is different from the clinical definition, okay? The legal definition is what you see on the screen under the HIB laws. And that means harassment, intimidation, or bullying means any gesture, written, verbal, or physical act, or any electronic communication, like email, whether it be single incident or a series of incidents that is reasonably perceived as being motivated either by any actual or perceived characteristic. mental, physical, sensory disability, distinguishing characteristic that takes place on school property at any school-sponsored function on a school bus or off school grounds as provided for in this legislation that substantially disrupts or interferes with the orderly operations of the school or rights of the students. And I'll get into it in a few more, I'll get to the next page in a few minutes, but this is a lot of text, okay? And basically, it's really saying that it applies to everybody that has a distinguishing characteristic. And the distinguishing characteristic is extremely broad. It doesn't necessarily, it's not limited to disabilities. And this particular law is not limited to disabilities. It applies to everybody, to a general education student, a special education student. It applies to every single student or actually really a faculty member in the school. It doesn't protect the faculty in that if a student bullies a teacher, it doesn't really protect the faculty, but it does protect the faculty if they identify bullying and they report it, then they're not deemed to be personally liable. Okay, so that's how it protects the faculty. So if they follow the proper procedures, it's not considered to be they're not considered to be liable. Okay, so that's the benefit of that. You might be saying, well, if it's occurring, everybody should be liable, which is what a lot of attorneys might say. But in fact, you know, what's really helping is that teachers want to get off the hook, so they are identifying it more so than they ever have before, and that's probably why you're hearing about it more. Admittedly, I've had some teachers and anti-bullying coordinators and specialists call me to say, I've seen this happen and I don't know what to do about it. I've taken it to my principal or supervisor and they're not doing anything, and they've asked me what to do about it. And I said document your attempts to report it to the proper authorities, and you know, which might include the board. And if necessary, you can go to your county superintendent, okay, or the Department of Education to report it, and in some circumstances, the police. So it really, it's really at the forefront of people's minds, and teachers are really responding to it in a positive light, okay, the ones who aren't the bullies, obviously. Okay, sorry about this. Okay, so my apologies. Having an issue with the okay, so this is what I just went over, and then so in addition to the factors identified before, if there's a distinguishing characteristic or somebody's picked on, it's considered bullying, harassment, or intimidation if a reasonable person should know that it would affect or harm a student or damage a student in some way. It has the effect of insulting or demeaning a student or a group of students, or creates a hostile educational environment for the student by interfering with the student's education, or by severely or pervasively causing physical or emotional harm to the student. When is the school district responsible if it occurs in school or outside of school? When it impacts the student's performance in school. Okay, and if you heard my last presentation, or if you just are familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, if something is really, school districts have an obligation to educate students who have IEPs in the area, well, with everybody, they have an obligation to address social, emotional, academic, and education and behavioral deficits, but for students with IEPs, they really have to address it, all of those areas through their individualized curriculum in the individualized way in which they learn. So if the student has a disability, or they might have a disability as a result of the bullying conduct, then the school district has an obligation to address it. So if it causes them, which I'll get into more later, but if it causes the students to be afraid of going to school, it doesn't necessarily have to impact their grades, It could impact their ability to socialize. Okay, they might become afraid of other students. They might not want to go to school. Okay, and that's not truancy if they have a disability and they don't want to go to school for a certain reason. It's called school refusal. So the school district has an obligation to address the school refusal issues, and so they have to identify the reasons that it's occurring, or any behavior. They have to identify the reason that the behavior is occurring and do something about it. Sometimes the reason that the behavior is occurring is because they're of a bullying situation. Either they are the bully themselves, or they are a victim of bullying, and maybe and they are obviously trying to avoid a situation. Okay, so that's just another. That's when the school district would be responsible. If something happens outside of school that prevents them from going, causes them to not want to go to school because they'll run into their peers, then the school district is responsible for addressing that particular situation. Okay, so the summary of disability harassment, it's bullying and teasing that's specifically based on or because of a disability. It creates a hostile environment by denying access to participation, receipt of benefits, for opportunities at school, and it is a denial of rights under the IDEA 504, the ADA, and the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination, and Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, although that is not as common it's not brought up as much as these other laws. So that's really, like I said, that's the summary. What types of bullying exist? There's verbal, there's, before I get to this, I'm sorry. Before I mentioned that there's the definition for bullying is different from a clinical perspective and the legal perspective. The legal perspective, as you may have seen before, it talks about a single instance or multiple instances of bullying. The clinical definition of bullying there are multiple incidents. They don't consider a single incident to be bullying. So obviously I'm biased, but I would tell you to look out for the legal definition because you have more rights there. How it's addressed, you might go by the clinical definition, but in terms of what your rights are, you go by the legal definition. So what types of bullying exist? Verbal, you have direct bullying. Somebody teases somebody and specifically targets them. I had a client who had Asperger's, and one particular student can constantly, one would argue, and we did argue, that constantly targeted another student with a disability. Once it became evident that they interpreted the situation wrong, that person kept on going after them. So it started out with, I'm not going to mention last names, but so you won't be able to identify the student, but the student's name was Luke, and the other student said, "Luke, I am your father," and that's from Star Wars. So in case you don't know, and Luke got really upset and said, "You're not my father," and that was a question as to whether that was bullying or not, because the student became upset. They became upset because of their disability. They didn't interpret the situation properly. But if it were two typical students, one might question whether it really is bullying, because they might just be two boys playing along. In that particular case, the school did not consider that to be bullying. But later on, once that student got upset, the quote-unquote bully started looking at the student, looking at Luke in the library, and throwing things at him and making faces, and he got upset, and then the bully kept on saying, "Oh, I'm doing it to my friends, I'm doing it to the guy who's sitting next to him." And then so the school district still did not consider that to be bullying. Then they were playing on the baseball field during recess, and the quote-unquote bully, or the alleged bully, slid into Luke, and he got hurt, and the school district again said it's not bullying. Later on, the quote-unquote bully targeted Luke in the closet, and he beat him up, and then that's when the school district said that it was bullying. So that could be considered direct because it's directly going to after the student. And then there were multiple instances, and the first one may or may not have been considered bullying, but after a while it was clear that it was. I would have probably made the argument that it started way ahead of that, but nevertheless, that's when the school district finally admitted that it was bullying. So you have verbal, which is indirect bullying. One might be like, Luke, I am your father. That example, just that alone could be considered indirect bullying, or maybe they're just not paying attention to the student, or that goes along with exclusion. They might not pick them as part of a team to be on their team, and if it's because of their disability or if it's constant, that might be considered to be bullying. Or if they leave them out of groups or group activities, that might be another one. Physical, theft, property damage, that's pretty obvious if you get hurt, if they beat somebody up. I have a situation now where a teacher hit a student in the nose, and the student came home with a red nose, and now we have an issue as to whether that's bullying, and obviously I will be making the argument that it is, because it's currently in litigation. I'm not going to go into it any further than that, but that would be an example of physical bullying. Property damage, picking on somebody's objects, going through somebody's bag. I had a situation where a student reported an instance, reported kids for cheating, and then they went through his bag later on in the locker room and found some other things, and then reported him for having some contraband in his bag. That arguably could be considered bullying. And then racial and sexual bullying is pretty obvious. Okay, so I was mentioning before that the effect of the anti-bullying legislation, is that if somebody identifies it, then they're not personally liable for failing to report it. That's separate from if the teacher participates in it, they could be liable if they participate in it, or if they're present and they don't take steps to prevent the situation. But there's a specific charge if they fail to report it, and they would be immune from that. If the school administrator receives a report and ignores it, that individual is subject to disciplinary action. Okay, and there are examples at the end as to what those disciplinary actions could be, and it's more than just a scolding. Okay, so in terms of what the process is, I know this is a lot of text, but laws generally do have a lot of text. The legal overview, these are the procedural safeguards that the school districts must follow if they've identified bullying. Every district has to have their own policy. Okay, the policy does include, in addition to what's in front of you, the policy includes the identification, the definition of bullying. This policy needs to be on the website, school website, and there needs to be lessons in the school about what's HIB, harassment, intimidation, or bullying. They should have lessons in the first or second week of school, or pretty early on, to identify it and what to do about it. In addition to social skills or situations, teaching students what to do if they've identified it. From the clinical perspective, there are three parties involved in a bullying situation, and that's the bully, the victim, and the bystander. The bully is obviously the person that's engaging in the situation. The victim is the one that's being affected by it. And the bystander is the one that sits there and sees it and can either do something about it or ignore it. And from the clinical perspective, the bystander is the most important person in the bullying situation. They can make the most difference if they witness a bullying situation. Because usually, and not always, but the bully is doing something for attention, positive or negative, but they're doing something for attention. And the bystander can either stop it, which would obviously negate purpose of the bully engaging in the situation, or they can report it, or they can go along with it. And so they really can impact the bullying situation. Once it occurs, once it's been reported or identified, the teacher or the school personnel must report it to the administrator verbally first, okay, and they must do that immediately. Then they must write it down and say what happened within 48 hours. They have to report it to the anti-bullying coordinator, and the anti-bullying specialist will be involved in the investigation, and they can use their judgment as to what that includes. It should include questioning the bully and the student and the victim, in addition to any witnesses. Not required to, but it really should. They should write the investigation, and they notify the parents of all individuals involved to the extent that it doesn't reveal their privacy issues. So they can say other students are involved, but they can't really relay names, or they're not supposed to because of privacy concerns. The parents do have access to the report, but the names should be redacted. If they want to charge them later on, then they can get that information through discovery. But from this perspective, the confidentiality provisions are pretty strong. So the school basically has to do the investigation and provide counseling or discuss what's available to help the students who are involved in the situation, to minimize the impact of the bullying on their education. All results must be reported to the superintendent within 2 school days of the investigation becoming final. Parents can request a hearing before the board to determine if it's deemed to be bullying. The parents can request a hearing to appeal it, and there could be testimony involved with that. And then the superintendent can decide if it's deemed to be bullying. That the superintendent can decide whether to punish student, provide the services, and then the board has to determine what it has to approve the actual punishment. And the punishment can vary according to the students. If they're classified, or meaning that they have an IEP, or they're not classified, the punishments may vary. If they have an IEP, and they cannot be expelled. If they can be suspended for up to 10 days without the district doing anything, but they cannot be expelled. If they're suspended for more than 10 days, the district has to first do what's called a functional behavior assessment to determine whether the bullying conduct is a manifestation of their disability, if it's directly related to their disability. If it is, then the district will then do a behavior intervention plan to address the behavior, to identify the behaviors, and replace the negative behaviors with a positive behavior. They can change the placement with parent approval, or if the student is a danger to himself or others. But generally, the students who have IEPs are protected from not generally, always, they're protected from being expelled from school or being suspended for more than 10 days. If they're a general education student, or if they have an IEP and it's not deemed to be a manifestation of their disability, they can be expelled, or their punishment is according to the school policy. If it's determined to be a bullying situation, the parents may appeal the board's decision to the Commissioner of Education. The parents of the victim may file a civil rights complaint within 180 days of the incident. This would be under the Law Against Discrimination, LAD. So they have 180 days to file damages for discrimination against the school district and against the bully themselves. Okay. So the last thing in terms of identifying bullying, in addition to the HIB definition, the bullying is not necessarily a criminal offense, but a lot of actions can be considered a criminal offense that fall within the definition of bullying. So assault, harassment, threats, robbery, and sexual offenses can be considered bullying, but they're also considered a criminal offense. If this is the case, the school district has an obligation to report the incidents to, or the offenses to, the police, and the police can do their own investigation. They are required to do their own investigation. If you just, you meaning parents, or a teacher just reports it to the police and doesn't report to the school, if it's a criminal offense, the police they have an agreement with the school district where they still have an obligation to report the incident to the school. So don't be surprised. I don't want you to think it's confidential if you report it to the police. It's not. If the school doesn't act, there are a bunch of different problems. They can get poor grades from the state. Meaning if they don't report the incidents and they get caught, they can get poor grades. They're at risk of violating a bunch of different laws, which is obviously my favorite area. The Law Against Discrimination, the American with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So those are the federal laws, and except for obviously the Law Against Discrimination. That's federal law, but it's also a New Jersey state law. And they could violate. There are different damages, or you have different rights under the different legislation. In addition to those laws, if the school fails to address the bullying, there are penalties from the Department of Education. They're violating the laws, and the claim is that they would be discriminating against students with disabilities. So basically, if they ignore the conduct and if they just ignore it and do nothing, then it's considered discrimination. Okay. I mentioned before that they're the bullying victims. These are the affected players, bully victims, and the bystanders. The bully, or this group, has the worst psychological and social outcomes of all parties involved, because maybe the bully does not understand the ramifications of their behavior. Maybe they can get in fights, they're disliked, or they could really get kicked out of school. There are various problems with that. And then obviously, and for the victims, their poor self-esteem. They could suffer from poor self-esteem. They could refuse to go to school. They might get quiet and withdraw from situations. They could if they have a disability, it could get worse. Maybe if they have autism and then they're bullied on top of that, then they could get more anxiety than just from transitions to failing to follow routines. Maybe now they're talking about anxiety from engaging in social situations more so than typical, or they just refuse to go to school. They obviously there could be physical injuries, etc. The bystanders, they're witnessing the attacks. But they could be negatively affected by watching it. They could also witness there are psychological effects with that. They might not want to report it because then they're the next victim. So they could be considered the suck up, for lack of a better term. That's a legal term, by the way. They could be considered that. And then they could be picked on. They could be made fun of for reporting it, or things like that. If the victim gets hurt, they could feel responsible for not doing anything about it, and then they also might lose their popularity status if they do report it. So there are psychological issues with regard to the bystanders, but the school does have an obligation, or they should. They don't have an obligation to necessarily insist that the bystanders report it, but they should really, in schools, through their bullying prevention programs, they should really give lessons on how to identify it, and for bystanders what to do about it. They're also required, maybe in the school, they're required to have an anonymous reporting policy. So in the event that the peers don't want to report it, they could do it without their names being known. So they're required to have, the school district is required to have an anonymous reporting policy. This goes along with the anti-bullying programs, but they also could be included in the IEPs. So in terms of goals and how to self-advocacy goals, promote skills to prevent students from becoming targeted. The different appearance, social isolation, disability, meaning less power, that they might feel intimidated by other people. They might be picked on for different behavior. It might require supports that others find to be challenging, and general exclusion from the school community. These are areas that should be addressed either through the school program, anti-bullying programs, or if a student has a disability and they have an IEP, these areas could and should be addressed through the goals. So that would include advocacy skills, social skills, appropriate behaviors, things like that. Any questions so far?
Hillary, we do have a few questions. The first is, if the school and the board refuse to act on a complaint of bullying and a parent does not have the financial means to pursue matters legally, what resources are available?
Well, if it's strictly, depending on the type of bullying that occurs, some attorneys will take the case on a contingency basis. So depending on the situation, you might not have to worry about having the legal means to hire an attorney. But regardless, you can file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. You can contact the Department of Education to investigate. You can contact your county superintendent, your school superintendent. Those are the different avenues that you can explore. If you absolutely can't afford, if you can't afford an attorney and you can demonstrate that you can't afford an attorney, there's the Office of Protection and Advocacy, or they provide nonprofit. It's a nonprofit agency, it's a state agency, and they provide free legal support. It's the Office of Public Advocate or the Office of Protection and Advocacy. It's the same agency. Another question?
Great, thank you. Yeah, we do have a couple more. Let me give you one more before you move on, if that's okay. If your child is being bullied on the bus, can you request a new bus? And that would go the same for the school. If your child is having bullying issues in school, can you request that they attend a new school?
You can request anything, whether it's granted or not is a different story. The answer varies. Well, not necessarily. I was going to say it varies as to whether a student has an IEP or doesn't have an IEP, but you can request the school district address the bullying situation. There's case law that says for students with IEPs that if the bullying has happened on more than one occasion or on several occasions, the school district should now be aware of it and do something to prevent that incident from happening again. So there is case law that says since where the school district has failed to remove the student from the situation and therefore they've been bullied again or hurt again, the school district has been deemed to have denied FAPE and should change the placement. So it's a lot of words to say, yes, you can ask for a change in bus or change in placement. If they say no, you have the option of filing a petition for mediation and due process to see for failing to address that. Or they might say, well, we'll provide an aide on the bus to interfere with the situation if that's occurring, and you can decide whether you think that's appropriate or not. One more question?
Great. So the next question we have is there specific training that the district provides to the anti-bullying specialist?
Yes, there are recommended programs that they're required to have, but they're not recommended programs are required to have. That doesn't make sense. There are recommended programs that the district should use to educate the anti-bullying specialist. The anti-bullying specialist is generally should be the psychologist or a therapist or somebody who has been trained in anti-bullying strategies. Everybody is required to be trained in anti-bullying strategies. The district has the right to decide how they're going to be trained. Okay, and if they don't, and if it's not effective, then they obviously have to find an alternative means of training them. Okay, so moving on. There's some behavior intervention plans for bullies and targets. Once the bullying has been identified, if it's a student with an IEP, you could do this with general education students too, you would do a functional behavior assessment if the student is engaging in negative behavior. And what the functional behavior assessment is an assessment to determine what is the purpose of the behavior or what the function is. So, for example, if a student is a bully, why are they engaging in that behavior? Is it because of attention? Is it because they're insecure? Is it because somebody picked on them? Why are they, and now they're retaliating? What is the purpose of their behavior? Why are they engaging in that? So there would be a behaviorist, a BCBA, who would be responsible for doing this functional behavior assessment. And once they determine what the purpose of the behavior is, you then develop a plan to extinguish that negative behavior and replace it with a more socially acceptable behavior. This can be for any behavior. It's not necessarily limited to bullying, but since we're talking about bullying tonight, that's why I'm mentioning it. So you would do a functional behavior assessment to determine what the function of the behavior is, and then develop a plan. So the plan would include strategies to address the motivation to the bully. So if they're doing it to engage in to get attention or get a teacher's attention, for example, the plan might include that the teacher would ignore the behavior depending on how aggressive it is. Because now if they're doing it to get the attention of the teacher and the teacher doesn't respond, one would say that the bully would no longer engage in that behavior because it's not achieving that purpose. Strategies to include discriminative cues for bullying. Identifying what's happening. It's basically distinguishing picking on somebody or just having an argument versus actual bullying. So that this behavior plan is really for the teachers. It's in the IEP, but it's for the teachers to determine how are they going to address bullying with this particular student. It's according to their individualized needs. This plan might not apply to everybody because not everybody has the same needs as this particular student. This student might learn differently. So that would include, so this plan is unique to the student. Replacement skill acquisition, what does that mean? How are you going to replace the negative skill with a positive, negative behavior with a positive skill? And then meaningful consequences for bullying and not bullying. So what will happen if they engage in the behavior, and also positive reinforcement if they don't engage in bullying, because that will help them replace the negative behavior with a more socially appropriate behavior. Other strategies this is in general and also for individuals with special needs. Prevention, you want to create the anti-bullying culture. This will help in the beginning of the school year and throughout. You want to teachers should constantly be reinforcing these particular areas. That students should not engage in bullying. It's not a positive thing. They're not going to get anywhere with it. And also the effects that it has on students, the psychological effects, what could really happen, and to the targets. And then this is also where teachers could say, to support the development of interfering skills with bystanders, that means just reinforce that bystanders really can make a difference, and they shouldn't just sit there and do nothing. Teachers should be involved in supervising everybody. If they need to be supervised, great, the teachers can get involved with that. And then what to do from adults, whether they should report it, how they should do interfere with the bullying situation right away, from adults, from victims, and by peers. And then after the fact, what are they going to do about it to prevent it from happening again? Like protections afforded to the target, obviously the victim. This is the legislation that says that, a statute that says that it establishes that a response to the person, not only the student who commits the act, must include more than traditional punitive damages. It can't just be yelled at or put in quiet time. It needs to be investigated, and depending on the student, the further acts further consequences need to take place. The overall school climate and culture, and the individuals and institutional factors that contribute to the climate. Yeah, in other words, the school district must address this, address the factors and the culture. If they tried one approach and it didn't work, they need to revisit it. They can't just say, all right, we gave the lesson and now we're done. They have to constantly take steps to fix the problem. And if parents of the victim can be involved in the remediation, they can be involved in they can and should be involved in the remediation of the behaviors for the bully, but they can also be involved in the remediation for the victim, what to do about it, whether it involves counseling, whether it involves teaching additional self-advocacy skills, or maybe teaching skills to understand the situation better, pragmatics. That can come from speech and language therapy, social skills therapy, counseling. This can all be through the IEP, related services in the IEP. This goes along, it's teaching the students skills to engage in a social interaction or develop peer relationships. The schools have an obligation to do that anyway, and this just reinforces that they should be providing the instruction necessary to teach the student the proper social skills. If the student's grades are fine, but they can't engage in social skills, they don't have proper social skills, the school cannot just ignore it because the grades are fine. They still have to address the social skills because it still affects their adversely impacts their educational performance. For example, if there's a group activity and the student is not engaging in the group activity for whatever reason, they're not learning from their peers, they're not learning to take turns. So it is still adversely impacting their educational performance, even though the grades might be okay, because they might not be graded in the areas where it affects. These are different areas that should be addressed through the IEP, and also these could be through the goals in the IEP. It could be taught through related services, and then there should be goals in the IEP to teach to monitor the progress of the students, monitor the students' progress towards learning these skills. So these are the different areas that the student should learn, and that could be incorporated into the IEP. If the bully, like I said, I was talking about earlier, if the bullying behavior will result in a suspension or a change in placement for more than 10 cumulative days, not consecutive days, cumulative days, so if it's over the course of the school year, this applies. The district must conduct a manifestation determination, and that is to determine an assessment to determine whether the disability is, whether the behaviors occurred because of their disability. If it is, then they need to do a functional behavior assessment if they haven't already identified the reason for the behavior, and then write a behavior plan to replace the negative behavior with a socially appropriate behavior. And like I said, if this conduct is not a manifestation, then they can be treated as a typical student as per the policy. Some examples of consequences would be for special ed student or a general ed student would be removal from class, admonishment, deprivation of privileges, classroom or administrative detention, referrals to disciplinarians like the principal or superintendent or somebody else who's in charge of disciplining students, in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension, and then if, depending on how severe it is, reported to law enforcement, expulsion with the exception of certain situations that relate to special ed kids, or for adult offenders like teachers, they could be put on administrative leave. I have situations that are that way now. It's a situation that I mentioned before with the student who has the red nose, because it was deemed to be the investigation. They learned that the teacher did hit the student. They're on an administrative leave until the investigation is final from the police. And then additional programs and training should be provided to the various teachers and school personnel. And I'm sorry about that. I hope you're having fun and not getting dizzy by this. Again, that might be the end of my presentation, which is why.
Hillary, we do have a Hillary, we do have a couple more questions if you're ready.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. What if the parent does not comply with the school's request for the child to receive social skills counseling when their child is found to be the offender?
Then you can say, well, honestly, it depends on what the school district does, but if you think that social skills counseling is necessary, then you can ask for that through the IEP process, and if they say no, then you can file a petition for mediation and due process arguing that they're not addressing behaviors and social skills. Just to clarify, when I say petition for mediation and due process, that is the way to challenge the appropriateness of the IEP. Once you file the due process petition, your attorney can do that for you, or if you want to do it on your own, you can. You file that with the Office of Special Education in New Jersey, and that's under the Department of Education. You file the complaint or the due process petition. Then you have either a resolution session or a mediation. You can have both. They're both meetings to resolve the issues in dispute. And the only difference is, well, there are two differences. The resolution session is just an informal meeting with you, the district to resolve the issues. If you come up with an agreement, you have to, and somebody breaches the agreement, you have to go to court to enforce the terms of the agreement. If you have a mediation, which it's similar to a resolution session, it's an informal meeting to resolve the issues in dispute, but it's facilitated by a mediator who's a third party from the Department of Education, and they're neutral. They can't be called to testify as a witness in court, but they're present to facilitate the agreement. If you reach an agreement, it's written down and it's enforceable for free by the Department of Education. If it's not resolved, then the matter is transmitted to the Office of Administrative Law for a due process hearing. Okay, next question.
Great, thanks, Hillary. What if your child is being bullied by a schoolmate outside of the school day, for example, around the neighborhood after school?
I guess the question is, what can you do about it? You certainly should bring it to the attention of the school, because it might impact your child's behavior in the school environment, and the teachers could separate them. Once they're put on notice, they have an obligation to address it. They can't claim that they don't know anything about it. So I would definitely notify them in writing, either through email or in a written form or in a letter of some sort. But you could you notify the school that it might affect the child's behaviors might be affected, or to look out for changes in behavior. And if it occurs in the school, you could, and then I'm sorry, following up on that, if you can make changes in an IEP meeting, you could determine what needs to be addressed through your child's emotional state. Maybe they need counseling or they need to learn self-advocacy skills. And then on top of that, like I was saying before, you report to the teacher and pay specific attention to it. If it's harassment and it doesn't affect the school environment, if something occurs like assault or harassment, then you can also report it to the police.
Great. And we do have one more question if you have time.
Sure.
It is, what if there is no witness to your child being bullied? Is their word good enough?
Their word is, every lawyer will start off every answer with it depends. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. If a witness might not identify the incident as actual bullying, because especially for students on the spectrum, they might interpret situations differently. So if your child feels like they're being bullied or harassed or they're intimidated because of another student, that needs to be addressed. Whether the actual bully gets in trouble, that would be investigated and an appropriate plan would be developed. Whether, it depends on the severity of their behavior. If it's somewhat innocent but it's just the victim is interpreting it poorly or inappropriately, then they might just be talked to and say, listen, ease up on the student or stay away from the student. The victim, on the other hand, can be taught skills through the IEP if that is in fact the situation. So I think Melanie said that was the last question. If there are any other questions, you can feel free to email me through my website. There's a contact us form on my website, which is right above, or you can email me at hillary@freemanlawoffices.com. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Hillary. We're having a little technical difficulty here. We thank everybody for joining us tonight. Just a reminder that you will be able to access this webinar on the Family Support Center website, and we will be forwarding the link to Hillary as well. So if you have anybody that you think that would enjoy listening and viewing the webinar, we highly recommend that you share that. And after this session, probably tomorrow, you'll receive an email asking for some feedback on the session. So we hope everybody has a good night. Thank you.